Happy 4th of July, guys. It's me, Jay. I just wanted to say, get on here and talk a little bit about current events, but how it relates to history. So basically, this is 4th of July. We made it to 250 years in existence, and the origin story of the United States goes a little something like this. On 1776, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 56 delegates from around the country got together and decided that it was time to break free of the bonds of England that tied us to our mother country, Great Britain. Now, this was preceded by a vote by the Parliament of Great Britain that they were going to tax us and tax us heavily, tax us on imported goods such as tea and stamps. And we couldn't get around it by doing business with the other major European power in North America, the French, because the British prohibited such things. So the Americans got tired of it, and they said, you know what? We're going to create a new country. We're going to create a freer country, a country where the average man could hope to aspire to become a nobility. Because in Europe, during that time, you had to be born into the nobility. There was kings and queens, not only in England, but in France, in Spain, in the Netherlands, in basically every country that did business in the Americas. In Portugal, that was a major power. But two of those major powers were France and Great Britain. And in 1754, the Virginia militiaman George Washington invaded a French fort, like right on the border between where the French they established fur trading territories throughout the Americas, where they were located in North America, and us, us the English enclave, because the French got here first, right? The French got here in the 1690s and first founded Canada, one of their initial settlements on the St. Lawrence River on July 24th, 1534. So they were here first. The first English settlement in North America wasn't until permanent English settlement wasn't until 1707 with Jamestown. They had several other attempts, attempts in the Caribbean, for example, attempts in Roanoke, the Roanoke colony, but they went awry for a number of reasons. But the relationship between England and France was always tenuous, going back to 1066, when William the Conqueror of Normandy, which was a kingdom in France, right, invaded in the Battle of Hastings, and basically vanquished the Anglo-Saxon ruling nobility. Now, according to legend, when it came to the Battle of Hastings, Edward the Confessor, the last Anglo-Saxon king, was the one who gave the crown to William the Conqueror, the Norman king. But despite if that's really what happened, England underwent a Frankification. England's an island, you know what I mean? So it's detached from the mainland of Europe. So a lot of times the stuff that mainland Europe was doing, the infrastructure that mainland Europe had over centuries of the system at that time during the Middle Ages, feudalism, it wasn't as ingrained in the little Anglo-Saxon enclave of England, right? Great Britain. So they didn't feel the brunt as much. But when mainland Europe comes knocking and your friends from across the English Channel come to invade you, now you're feeling the brunt of it. Now the English language, the Anglish language, that the Anglos and the Saxons shared, which was like a pidgin German, because they'd come from northern Germany over during the fourth and fifth century. Horsa and Hengist, two Anglo-Saxon twins that are considered basically the founders of of England, right? Britain was there, Britannia. The Romans called it Britannia. That was like the frontier of the Roman Empire. The furthest west they went, uh, you know, the Britons were Romanicized. They spoke a little bit in Latin. They were originally a Celtic people, much like the Irish and the Scottish. And their relatives, but they became Latinized. Eventually, when Rome adopted Christianity, they became Christians too, right? That's why Saint Patrick was an uh, uh, Romano-Briton patrician, because that's what they were during that time. Romano-Briton patricians. They were upper class, and they were converted to Christianity. They spoke Latin, but after the fourth and fifth century, of course, we know that Rome, Western Rome anyway, experiences a sharp decline, and there's Germanic invaders, and in England it's the Angles and the Saxons, and they settle in. They have these kings. They have the Germanic traditions of council democracies, which becomes the Witan, which eventually under Norman rule becomes the Parliament, and that becomes ingrained in the English common law system, especially with the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215. So this is the English tradition of free governance, because England had the geographical advantage of being an island and not being so connected, to what was going on in mainland Europe, especially in France and Germany. What will become the French and German-speaking territories. You know what I mean? So they're cool. They're chilling with their uh, council style democracies, and that eventually carries over and becomes ingrained in law. But by the time we get to 1776, by the time England has spread out, Columbus has sailed the New World in 1492 on behalf of the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, and he claims all of the Americas for Spain, even the parts of the Americas that, like North America, they didn't really discover that. Columbus never went to any of the mainland Americas, which is why the mainland of America is not called Columbia. It's called America because Amerigo Vespucci came after him, and Amerigo Vespucci was the first to reach the coast of South America, Venezuela, I believe, to be exact. But when it comes to North America, it was really a hard nut to crack, and the French, with Champlain and Jacques Cartier, were some of the first to do that. They got here first. The British had trouble, and because Britain wasn't really a great world power per se before, uh, you know, um, sailing across the Atlantic Ocean and deciding to colonize what would become the United States. Not really. I mean, she barely fended off an invasion by Spain herself in 1588 with the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Right? So she wasn't a huge nation, but through the colonization of America and the cultivation of crops such as cotton and tobacco, especially in the beginning, she becomes a powerful nation, becomes a world power to be exact during that time. And France is also a world power, and since they're old adversaries, since they fought a war for 100 years over secession, over who was going to go to the throne, and over the fact that Normandy was technically a French-speaking province and part of France, but was considered part of the realm of England. And basically the English wanted to break away and rebel against their French rulers because for centuries after the Battle of Hastings, it was basically a system where the peasantry was on the bottom and they were of Anglo-Saxon descent, and the upper class were on the top and they were of French descent. So basically, by declaring the English throne independent from that of the French throne, England became a nation then and there after the Hundred Years' War and then after the Battle of the Roses over the succession to the English throne occurs. And then you have the English Civil War, you have Magna Carta is established, but Magna Carta is then embellished to a very large degree, to a point where people are saying maybe we don't need the monarchy anymore. Maybe it's an outdated concept. And then you have the Enlightenment coming along in France and Britain because of the industrialization, because of the fact that these two nations have become world powers. Because what was different about France and Britain than Spain and Portugal was that when Spain and Portugal colonized the land, yeah, some hacienda owners and some landowners got rich and wealthy and fat off it, but inevitably, because they were heavily Catholic, and the Pope was a political maneuver, a political mover in the Spanish and Portuguese world, in the way that he wasn't in France. The church got most of the land ownership, and it wasn't. They didn't really have free enterprise. They didn't really have capitalism, mercantilism in the way that the French, the Dutch, and the English had. You know what I mean? So the Spanish colonies start to decline in power, Peru and Mexico, and in their place come these French fur trading empires in Canada and the Midwest, and of course in sugar and typical slave plantation economies in warmer climates like Louisiana and stuff like that, in representation for the French. But the British, they had their tropical colony already in Barbados and the Caribbean, and then they would later move it over to South Carolina, where that would begin the beginning of that's that West Indian style of slavery into the American mainland. They say 1619 was the first, where it switched over from African indenture. They would offer people trips from Africa to the Americas as indentured laborers, and they worked for a time period, and they would be completely free. Same with the white laborers, but eventually that switched over, and it just became a thing where if you were born black and if you were born of African descent, even a little bit of African descent, you were considered as classed as a black person, and you were considered a chattel property. And even if you did manage to come free under whatever circumstances, like say your master put it in a paper contract, you would be admitted. Manumitted, you would be manumitted, but then you would still be a second-class citizen, even as a free person. Even as later on after the American Revolution, several states, especially in the North, they leave the slave economy. Slavery gets abolished in those areas, but even black people in those areas still second-class citizens, still subject to discrimination. But the point is, that France and Britain are two big powers by the time we get to the American Revolution. And Britain doesn't want any more beef with France. They've had wars and wars, but what George Washington does this, it angers the French. So the French go to war. And eventually, what ends up happening is Canada, they have the what they call in American history the French and Indian War. And this is a misnomer because in world history they refer to this event as the and this time period, the 1754 to 1763, as the 7 Years' War, and that makes more sense, even though it went a little bit over 7 years. When they refer to it as the French and Indian War, and you're a kid learning in school, you start to think that the war was between the French and the Indians. Because Indians or Native Americans, they're called Indians because Columbus was trying to find a faster route to India that did not include them going through the Muslim world. So he landed in the Bahamas and the Dominican Republic and the Caribbean, and he thought he never seen Indians. He only heard about them through the writings of Marco Polo. But he misnomered the people as citizens of India or the land of India, as it was called in English, in Spanish and English, and in Europe. While in the Middle East and the Muslim world, it was called Hindustan because the land of the Hindus, right? But he called these people that he met Indians, even though they were no relation, no genetic relation to Indians. Native Americans originate over the Bering Strait land bridge that connects Alaska and Asia, and they're originally of East Asian descent. And they came to populate all of the Americas from the top of Canada to Tierra del Fuego in Chile. And there was wars between themselves and European settlers, Pequot Wars in New England, and the Iroquois Wars in the Jamestown settlement in Virginia. So um, the title of that would lead you to believe that's what that is, a conflict between France and the Indians, right? No, but it isn't. It's a conflict with the French and the Indians teaming up against the British and the Americans, right? The white settlers that live in America, they call themselves Americans, right? So England wins this war. England expands her territory. Now England includes Canada, and also taking place in 1757 in India itself is the Battle of Plassey. And what the Battle of Plassey is a battle between France and Britain over India, because England had tremendous amount of influence through the British East India Company, which was a trading company, a private corporation in India, and had tremendous influence over the Nawabs, the Muslim rulers, the Mughal Muslim rulers in India, and basically was controlling them, right? Until there was a rebellion by both Hindus and Muslims called the Sepoy Rebellion, and then the British government had to step in and say, wait a minute, we're going from indirect rule, we're ruling through the British East India Company, to direct rule, where we're just ruling over India and the creation of the British Raj, right? But for a while there, just like in the Americas, the French had competition with the British in India. So India could have easily ended up a French colony, and Indian call center people wouldn't be bothering you as much. And they'd be bothering people more in Montreal and French-speaking territories. You know, like Morocco became French, Algeria, Tunisia, all the North African countries and West African countries became French territories. India could have been that too, but the Battle of Plassey said different. So basically, Britain is expanding her territory, and it's a lot, not just in North America, but all over the world. And it's due in large part to the efforts built up by the strong economy of these 13 colonies that they have along the eastern seaboard, which would form the United States. But we're not seeing any of the benefits of it. Then the war happens, and wars cost money. So what does Britain do? Britain raises their taxes on imported goods, right? So things cost twice as much, um, due to Britain's new policy, and this is really strangling the colony as a whole. Remember, uh, each colony was basically an autonomous, functioned as an autonomous state within its own. They had their own state constitutions. They were independent. Connecticut was one of the first ones. So, and had different cultures. You had the slave plantocracy culture that existed in places like the Carolinas or Virginia, especially in South Carolina, not really in the North Carolina Piedmont section, where it wasn't really suitable for farming, but in places where it was suitable for plantation type economies, you had the slave economies, and they were rich. And most of the founding fathers, most of the early presidents were from this class of people, Virginia planters. And then you had the tradesmen, the merchants, the merchant classes, and they were more prolific in the Northeast. England had kind of, I guess you could say, going to war with the Dutch and acquired New York, which was a prosperous Dutch colony. So, and there were differences among them. So, for example, in one of the early drafts of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, who was the author of the Declaration, puts in there about emancipation, because everybody is now reading the works of Thomas Paine, Common Sense, and other works talking about these Enlightenment ideals, because people are discovering the ideas of republicanism, reading Plato, reading some of these ancient writers that dealt with republicanism and dealt with democracy, because democracy and republicanism, as we've talked about, has been tried in other parts of the world, not just in the United States. It was tried in the ancient world, but it often failed, because what had happened in Rome. Rome is the closest approximation to what we have in our current system. And what happened in the late stages of the Republic in Rome was that nothing ever got done. It was gridlock, and the people suffered and the people starved. So when it came down to make that choice, when the die was already cast, as it were, during the Roman Civil War in 44, around 44, 43 BC, the Roman populace was ready to make that jump into dictatorship, even though Roman history and Roman lore had taught them to look distastefully and look disdainfully upon dictators, and especially kings, because Roman had kings. Roman had like 6 or 7 kings, as we said before, and they were corrupt and they were looked down upon in Roman history. The rereadings of Roman history champion republicanism, champion freedom, champion democracy, champion civilization, but they were ready to accept democracy and dictatorship in a new form. So even though they were built upon the principles of republicanism, and if you ask, I guess, the average everyday Roman, were they living in an empire or were they living in a republic governed by the rule of law, the 12 tables of Roman law? I would think that around the time of the Emperor Octavian or Emperor Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, I would think that they believed that they were living in still the Republic age. They didn't see any major changes probably until much, much later, because they were against that kind of thing. They were against absolute rule, against absolute monarchy. In Greece, it was more of a democracy, and that kind of went awry, because what happens in a democracy is that the strong will overpower the weak, the majority will overpower the minority, and that's eventually what happened. And Greek democracy fell apart when the Athenian city-state just basically collapsed into itself, into the Macedonian Empire. So they weren't necessarily trying anything new that hadn't been done before. It hadn't been done for a number of years on a large level because you had, republics like the Netherlands, basically, or San Marino, or places like that, little small isolated places. But on a large scale, you didn't really have it in the world. But the Americans went for it, and 56 delegates signed the Declaration of Independence, and it says we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So now we get to the crust of the video. And the crust of the video is about how this relates to the modern day. How does this relate to Donald Trump? How does this relate to the one beautiful bill? The one big, beautiful bill that Donald Trump is proposing? Easy. Because once again, like the American Revolution, taxes are at the center of this. Taxes are what he is drumming on, the drum that he is using to pass this by. Because he knows that the American people subconsciously, we gained our independence, we fought the War of Independence, we fought the American Revolution to get rid of taxes, to get rid of what we perceived as unfair taxes. That was the slogan of the American Revolution. No taxation without representation. And Trump knows this. Trump also knows this base. He knows the Republicans. The Republicans are the ones that are small government, because what happened after the American Revolution, the last battle, the Battle of Yorktown, General Charles Cornwallis surrenders, and America's objectives are achieved thanks to help from the French, help from the Spanish, help from Britain's European rivals. America and that, despite the hurdles of getting the Hessian troops, Hessians from Persia, as mercenaries, the British did, we won. We did it. We achieved it. We achieved something in history that was a milestone. But there were several questions to be answered. Like, you need taxation, right? The whole revolution was based off an anti-taxation kick. That's what started it. But you need taxation in order for a government to function. So they draw up this thing called the Articles of Confederation, and this is a total mess. This is what is called in Israeli Hebrew a balagan, basically a ball of confusion. And each state has its own currency. They function as mini countries. There was no unity among them. So they throw that out and they put the Constitution in place. But even then, even after the Constitution, which Delaware becomes the first state to ratify it, even after the Constitution, you still have elements of this libertarian anti-taxation thing. So eventually George Washington, what he has to do is then he has to send troops out against his own people to get their tax money. So taxes, he becomes the first president of the United States under the Constitution. So this whole issue of taxation, this was the reason. So I guess the American government, the newly elected American government, was very squeamish about taxation, because taxation, many people perceive, like they did in the Bible, with Matthew the tax collector, that taxation is theft. Now, the Bible, there was a whole other dimension, the fact that Israel was, Judea at that time was under Roman colonization. They were giving a tax to a foreign people, and technically under Judaism, that's Avodah Zarah, that's foreign worship, basically. But even without that element of it, taxation is always perceived as theft to many people. That's a common libertarian saying. It's like, you got the fruit of your labor, you should be able to keep the fruit of your labor, and for a government to take that is very intrusive. And Americans have always had that attitude about that particular subject, and conservatives have always had that attitude because, again, the newly government splits into two different parts. There are parts that want the states to remain as autonomous as they can, like the Articles of Confederation, with it still being a functioning government. And that is led by Thomas Jefferson. He leads his party, which is called the Democratic Republicans. The other side is Alexander Hamilton. He believes that central banking should play a role, that the federal government in Washington, D.C. should be, it was originally New York, but New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C., there were three different capitals moved around during George Washington's time. Right. But because John Adams becomes the first president to live in the White House, what was then called the Executive Mansion. But there's differences. Hamilton is a federalist because he believed in a strong federal government, and Thomas Jefferson does not. Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, third president of the United States, he does not. He believes in a very small federal government. He was against federal overreach. Ironically, his biggest achievement was the 1803 purchase. One of his biggest achievements as president was the 1803 purchase of Louisiana, the Louisiana Territory from the French, because the French go through the French Revolution, then Napoleon comes to power, and France becomes severely weakened. And by the time of 1803, the United States has the upper hand on France, and Napoleon just wants to sell this territory because he's already lost the main cash crop of the French Empire, which is Saint-Dominique, which is Haiti, right? He's lost that already, right? Haitian. He says 4th of July is canceled because of Trump. That revolution has already happened, so he decides to sell, most of France's territory in the United States to the Americans. So that was an example of federal overreach that Jefferson didn't even follow his own doctrine. He tripled the size of the United States, which ended up being good, but was not by the book conservative. So there's this conservative faction that they want less government, and then there's the liberal faction, at that time the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Later on, you have other parties, the Whig Party, they basically adopt the mantle of liberalism, and they want a big federal government with a lot of social spending, infrastructure projects, and they fall apart over the issue of slavery. But and then in the 1850s, you have the Republicans. They come to light and come to power in Wisconsin. They were founded in 1854. But modern day Republicans are different. Over the Republicans, the original Republicans were like the Whigs, but the only thing none of them abided by slavery. The Whigs were split because Northern Whigs were against slavery, like the Northern attitude to its abolition, and the Southern Whigs or the Cotton Whigs that supported the Southern culture and supported slavery. But Republicans, no, they almost had no support in the South. They were completely a Northern party, and their main objective was to elect a president that would eventually abolish slavery, and that did happen in 1860. So we have the Civil War. Of course, we know the North wins. Slavery is abolished. 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation. Slavery officially ends in all of the United States in Galveston, Texas, on June 19th, 1865. But still, there are other issues. There are other issues The Democrats largely remain a party with a mass loyalty in the South after the Southern states rejoin the United States. There's reconciliation. Real reconciliation doesn't even begin until the next war, really, in the 1890s, the Spanish-American War. That's when real reconciliation between North and South really begins. Before that, they were still on some bad blood. The Northerners looking to look. We went through this war. Johnny Reb, punished the rebels right through Reconstruction, punishing the South, really taking from her, invading her, treating her like an invaded country like Iraq. What I mean, or Afghanistan. Federal troops quartered in your home. You were once a rich planter, and now you got federal troops from Massachusetts or from Rhode Island or from Vermont, or New York or New Jersey, or Massachusetts. Said Massachusetts, but any northern state stationed in your freaking quarters now, and you live in Virginia or South Carolina or Texas or Louisiana, wherever. Really intrusive. So there was a lot of bad blood up until we had another common enemy in Spain in the 1890s. So, and then of course World War I, World War II, and Republicans and Democrats, they swapped positions. But particularly after World War I is where you start to get the late 1800s, early 1900s. You start to get industrialization. And once you start to get industrialization, you start to create a dynamic of rich and poor, similar to what Europe was going through at the same time. And you start to have these people that believe even stronger, the social liberals that believe even stronger that a social safety net is the only thing that will save this modern day industrial economy of industrialized capitalism. But they need a social safety net. They need Medicare. They need nationalized health care. They need this stuff. They need unions to protect workers and to protect the common people. That the government should play a more robust role in guaranteeing these rights. Now, obviously, at that time, this is the early 1900s, basically after World War I, the 1920s, the Republicans are in power. And they began to favor the status quo, where at one time they favored big government, during their origins coming out of the Whig Party. A lot of what Abraham Lincoln was doing, other than the stuff he was doing that we know him for in history, he was also creating an putting money into infrastructure projects, railroad building, the Trans-Pacific Railroad at that time, using government money in that way. The Whigs were for that, and obviously the early Republicans were for that as well. Government intervention into the economy. But by the 1920s, they're making so much money during the Warren Harding era and the Calvin Coolidge era and the Herbert Hoover era, basically the end of World War I till about 1933 when till about 1929 when the good times are over and the Great Depression happens. So basically they start to implement these different changes. But the Great Depression is one of the best things that could have happened to the social liberals, the ones who wanted a stronger social safety net, because here they can point to it and say, see, we told you you need a stronger social safety net. Look what happened after the stock market crash of 1929. People are on the street. People are living destitute. We told you that we need this, right? So during that time, President Franklin D. Roosevelt wins the election by a landslide in 1933. Basically, everybody had lost hope in Herbert Hoover by that point. Things are occurring in Europe that would lead to the Second World War at that time, too. Because it happened everywhere. It happened globally. It happened in Italy. It happened in Germany. It happened in Japan. All industrialized nations. They're all feeling the brunt of it. And they turn to governments that, authoritarian governments that will offer them the same social safety net, that in the same sense of security that Americans are looking for. But with Americans, we got FDR, and he was a Democrat. He believed in the principles of the American experiment. He wasn't going to turn his back on it, despite what his detractors were saying that he was going to use this opportunity to turn America into a democracy and stack the Supreme Court and all that other stuff that they were accusing him of at the time. Republicans were accusing him of, right? He enacts these social programs, including the Social Security Act. In 1935 to ensure that people have a little bit saved up, in case something were to go wrong, especially when they retire, for the elderly and for the disabled, because FDR himself was a person with a disability. He became, um, inflicted with polio at a very young age, so he was sympathetic to this. He is a very successful presidency. He dies as the president, as a matter of fact. And these social safety nets are very popular with the American people. Fast forward to the 1960s. President Kennedy is assassinated in November 22nd, 1963. And during this time, there was a lot of struggles, as we know, with the USSR. The World War II happens. The outfall of World War II is that the the Soviet Union, and the United States are the two remaining powers, and they split up. Europe, Soviet Union in the east, and the Allied powers of France, Britain, and the United States in the west. Cut off is Berlin. But even around the world, in Latin America, which is America's backyard, and Cuba especially, and China, in Asia, these two countries start to influence people. America has its allies, and Russia had its allies. That they influence, their sphere of influence. Both countries have it. So we're in the midst of it, and the Cuban Missile Crisis happens, and all that stuff. But Kennedy then gets assassinated, and with the sympathy of Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Johnson puts it into effect. He is going to create a Great Society program. FDR had the New Deal, where he basically increased the power of the federal government exponentially. Now Lyndon Baines Johnson, is going to increase it even more with programs for the poor, particularly Medicaid and SSI, other things. Making life. Yeah.
It wouldn't be discriminated, would it?
I don't know.
He would get in.
Yeah, I don't know who that could be then.
It ain't discriminated. Discriminated gets in. I'm not ringing the bell. These freaking people just ring the wrong freaking bell. Who? Watch, let me see. Who is it? Who is it? What do you want? Okay, let me go to the door.
So he's instituting these.
He wants me to open the gate. Hold on, John. God, really? He got his grill in there. What are you freaking ask me for? Ready, I'll do it through the window. I knew it wasn't a exterminator. Is it opening? Here. Be careful with it because it's loose. Okay. You feel it? Okay. Oh, no, it closes by itself. Hurry up, hurry up.
So they
You're
began.
stuck in there. Oh, well. It ain't old fashioned no more that I close it. I'm sorry, Heidi, for messing with your video.
That's right.
Okay, John.
They began to institute
So anyway,
these reforms, Medicaid, other things for the poor, the Great Society, to expand once again the definition of liberal, because the idea is you cannot be free. It's not just negative rights. It's not just things that the government can do, but a part of freedom is to create a better quality of life, and these programs will do such things, right? These Great Society programs. And people pretty much accepted it because this was the convention. This was what they call the post World War II consensus that yes, the larger social safety net is good. You can tweak it, but you can't really do away with it. So the next administration, the Nixon administration is not so like he's a conservative Nixon, but in the sense that he wants to get rid of these anti-war protesters because America gets into the war in Vietnam in 1955 to support our allies in Vietnam, our allies in Vietnam against the communist influenced government, mainly coming from Ho Chi Minh's government being influenced by its larger neighbor in China, right? So we want to get involved in this civil war because we don't want yet another Asian country to fall to communism. So we get involved in this war, trying to help. Initially, trying to, help the French because the French still wanted to remain in Vietnam. So we're like, okay, yeah, we're gonna help the French still colonize the Vietnamese. They got rid of the Vietnamese got rid of the Japanese during World War II, but we're gonna help the French get back into that area called French Indochina. Right? Little did we know that we'd be quagmired into that war, and the French would gradually pull out, and the Americans would be left with the bill fitting it. And Kennedy wanted to move out because he saw it as an impossible situation that the America and its allies could not win. Kennedy's assassinated. Johnson, and because of these Great Society reforms, a lot of people thought Johnson was a dove, a super liberal, and the Democrats, keep in mind, still had that Southern constituency that they needed to maintain, and Johnson himself was a Southerner. But in 1964 and 65, he passes the Civil Rights Act in 64 and the Voting Rights Act in 65, guaranteeing the voting rights of African Americans. So they've been guaranteed by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, during the Civil War, but state governments overruled that, and Jim Crow was instituted in 1894. 1894 to 1896 in most of the former Confederacy states. So that was the federal government wasn't enforcing it, but in 64 and 65, Johnson finally committed to doing so, to getting rid of Jim Crow, making Jim Crow illegal. So this alienates him from his largely Southern white conservative base. So he needs to do something to make himself seem tough and to re-ingratiate himself with the Republican, the conservative establishment of the Southern Democrats. And one of the ways to do that was be tough on communism, be tough on global communism, and go gun ho into this Vietnamese civil war, halfway around the world in Southeast Asia, this civil war. So he intensifies it, and that leads his campaign to be wildly unpopular, leading to the election of Richard Nixon in basically Richard Nixon capturing all the southern states in 1968, something that we've talked about, right? So with that now, but even then, Nixon still did stuff for the environment, still, increased a lot of social safety net. One of the things Nixon did was have these work programs, particularly targeting African Americans, because the idea was, okay, now the civil rights movement is over. This is the late 60s, early 70s. What we're going to do is try to integrate, African Americans who have been behind on a lot of things because of legal restrictions like Jim Crow in many parts of the country, to reintegrate them into the economy through work training and stuff. So Nixon was not against using government to help people, not against that. But then in the Republican Party, there's the grassroots conservative movement led by failed presidential candidate in 1964, Barry Goldwater, who he believed in massive cuts, undoing the reforms of the Great Society like Medicare and Medicaid. Nixon expanded it. Nixon put Medicaid in place. Nixon put SSI in place, right? So Nixon was a Republican, but he was not against it. But these grassroots conservatives inspired by Barry Goldwater, they were the underground conservatives. And during the 1970s and 80s, they were going to capture the imagination of the party. And by 1980 was the Reagan Revolution. They were going to turn back the clock. All the post World War II consensus of that the bigger the government, the better the government. It wasn't necessarily the size of the government, but how efficient it ran. That was overdone with. Now there were promises in the new Republican Party of complete cuts, tax cuts across the board that would gut all these social programs. And since that time, that's been the mantra of the Republican Party. They've been wanting to turn back the clocks of the New Deal. And they've had mild success. Reagan, who came in 1980, he did not have a lot of success doing such things. He would make promises to concessions to the Democrats in the government that he wasn't going to do that. And he never really did. He wanted to, but he never really did. And there was fears that he would do that during both his terms, both in 1980 and reelected in 1984. He didn't do it, right? And then you have Clinton. Clinton comes in as, like I said, a sheepish Democrat. Reagan Revolution. Not only did Reagan's opponent in 1984, former Vice President Walter Mondale, lose by a landslide. Michael Dukakis in the 1988 election also lost to Reagan's Vice President George H.W. Bush. So this idea of big government liberalism, of using the power of government to help people enhance their life and enhance liberty, this is no longer. This notion doesn't exist anymore. You know what I mean? This notion doesn't exist in our new political reality when Clinton is elected for his first election in 1992. And through that time, Clinton played along. Clinton was kind of like, a semi-Republican. The crime bill in '94, the massive cuts in welfare in the '90s. Creating this new style of Democrat. But then what happens then is 2008 happens. In 2008, the housing bubble burst and the stock market crashed again, the worst crash we've experienced since the Great Depression. And the idea that the government could be used as a tool to enhance the lives of people and enhance the lives of many people who had been poor now because of these wars, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and then most importantly, the stock market crash of '08. It became a new mission of the New Democrats with their newly elected president, Barack Obama, to do that, to reverse course of not only the Reagan Revolution, but of the lightweight Democrats like Clinton that were doing damage to these social programs. And, Obama tries again, as many Democrats before him since Truman, I believe, or since Truman or Roosevelt, to push for a nationalized healthcare system. England has one. Basically all our allies across the Western world, modern day nations, have a nationalized healthcare system, and Americans are on board with it, but they're not on board with it because Obama's a very divisive president. Obama was the first black man to be elected as president of the United States, and the United States is a country that has struggled with racism. When the country was founded in July 4th, 1776, most of the country's black population was enslaved. You know what I mean? And then we struggled with hundreds of years of slavery existing after that, and hundreds of years of discrimination and Jim Crow. And the idea that African people or people of African descent are second-class citizens here in the United States was pretty much cemented into our consciousness, into our national consciousness. As much as liberty, as much as freedom was, as much as all these other lofty platitudes were, racism was too. So the fact that Barack Obama broke that glass ceiling and became the first black president, that angered a lot of people. So they were against the Obamacare, even though it could be used to benefit them. They were against it, boy. And when Trump gets in 2016, Trump then makes it his mission. Before even Trump, even the Tea Party movement. The Tea Party movement begins almost after Barack Obama is elected, and it's the tax enough already movement. The idea that Obama will use this crisis to raise taxes and to create a lot of social programs and undo what basically the Republicans have been doing for the last 30 years. That was a fear among Republicans, so they organized the Tea Party. And then you have candidates being elected by Tea Party caucuses in the early 2010s, including Paul Ryan, including Mitt Romney, who wasn't really that ingratiated to the Tea Party base, but he was kind of ingratiated to them. They nominated him as their candidate in 2012. He loses to Obama, and they feel like all hope is lost until Trump rises up. And Trump in 2016 makes it his mission to overturn the ACA. He wasn't going to do anything to Medicare and Medicaid, the already established brands, but the ACA that Barack Obama instituted, that he was going to gut and get rid of and replace it with something else, Trumpcare. That gets voted down thanks to the deciding vote of John McCain. The last thing John McCain did before passing away was overturn that motion. Now, Obamacare or the ACA is pretty much cemented into the American consciousness. But now, Trump is back. Trump, his second term, he wants to gut even more. He wants to gut Social Security. He wants to gut Medicare. He wants to gut Medicare. He wants to basically eliminate, with this big, beautiful bill, almost hundreds of years of progress that we've achieved of expanding the meaning of freedom, expanding the meaning of liberalism, what it means to be in a liberal democracy. Does it just mean that you have certain rights that are certain negative rights, like for example, you have the right to speech, you have the right to you have the right to bear arms, you have basically the 10 Bill of Rights that we have. But say, for example, there are other hidden meanings. Like how can you have freedom of speech, for example, if you are nonverbal and you can't talk, but you don't have the ability, you don't have the technology to have like a Dymo box or a talker for you, and you have severe CP, and you need that from the federal government. Then you technically don't have the freedom of speech. So this idea that since the 1920s the social liberals have come up with is that in order to have these negative rights, like the right to, you, the right to religion, or the right to believe in your religion, or the freedom of the press, or freedom of the speech, or freedom of whatever, freedom of ownership, in order to achieve the maximum of the pursuit of happiness, in order that last phrase, the pursuit of happiness, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In order to have the pursuit of happiness, you have to have your basic needs met. And it is the government's responsibility, if you cannot do it for yourself, to meet those requirements. You know, for example, if you have money, purchasing power, then you have a greater voice. But if you are unable to work because you're disabled, then you won't be able to have money. You won't be able to earn uh, um, you won't be able to earn a good living, a sustained living. So, what good is freedom of speech if you can't, have money to pay to buy your food? You know what I mean? So, liberalism is based on the idea that of those negative rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, etc. But it expounds upon those terminologies and those concepts to mean a greater freedom, a freedom of opportunity, a freedom to fulfill who you are as a person, right? And that relates to trans rights as well, which is covered in this big beautiful bill. So let's get into it. What this big beautiful bill entails. Okay, the House passed a massive tax and spending bill that includes signature policy of President Trump's second agenda this Thursday, sending the so-called big beautiful bill to the president's desk ahead of the July 4th deadline. The House approved 218 to 214 vote Thursday. The Senate narrowly approved the bill 51 to 50. Okay, at the center of this big beautiful bill, Medicaid restrictions. This legislation includes restrictions on Medicaid and provide government-sponsored health care for low-income and disabled Americans. The bill imposes work requirements for some able-bodied adults and more frequently eligible checks. In other words, if they deem you not disabled enough, then you have to work. Now you have to not. So it's up to their discretion, basically, if you receive these certain entitlements, right? The Senate parliamentarian determined that a measure cutting federal funds to states that use Medicaid infrastructure to provide healthcare coverage to undocumented immigrants, along with banning Medicaid from covering gender transition services. So again, we get to the root of this, what this is really all about. This is really all about, it's about targeting the poor and obviously targeting minorities, because let's just face it, Lee Atwater was the campaign manager for President Reagan, as well as President George Bush Sr. He said that in in 19 in the 1950s, you could say N word, N word, N word. Then you can't say the N word anymore. So now you get to more abstract arguments. And by the time you get to the 80s and 90s, and talking about taxes is a way to talk about race. Talking about entitlements, government entitlements is a way to talk about race, because if you cut them, then they say that black stuff are worse than whites. That's what he surmised. But I don't think that's the case here. I think everybody's going to be hurt by it. Some Republicans proposed steeper cuts to Medicaid funding, in part decrementally lowering the provider tax from 6% to 3.5% by 2032. The timeline is delayed by 1 year from the Senate's GOP initial proposal. The legislation includes more than $46.5 billion for the border wall. So again, this is the border wall at work. But like I was saying, another thing is there was restriction on Medicaid is to target the trans community as well as to target undocumented workers. So it's part of that larger crusade. And they said Project 2025 wasn't real. Increasing the state and local taxes. There's an increase in the state and local taxes. The package also includes an increase to cap on the state and local tax adjustment, raising it from $10,000 to $40,000 after 5 years. It returned $10,000, a departure from the initial House passed bill. So basically, to substitute the large tax cut of the federal government, they're going to have to increase your state taxes, which would impact you even further as a consumer. Because again, like the example of the American Revolution, what happened when we talked about it? What happened when the British imposed greater taxes on the American colonists? Prices of stuff went up, which is why they wanted to purchase their tea from France and not from England. It was the cause of the Boston Tea Party. So by increasing the state taxes, the consumer suffers more because they suffered directly. Because the increase of taxes, now the employers are going to have to increase prices in order to pay for higher wages. And essentially making it harder to live and the cost of living to rise even further. Green energy policy. The final bill passed by the Senate will largely terminate numerous tax incentives. So what Joe Biden was trying to do, Joe Biden was one of the most environmentally friendly presidents that we've ever had, next to Theodore Roosevelt, right? He was trying to decrease our carbon footprint and increase, green production by lowering taxes on businesses that use safer methods that wouldn't harm the environment so much. And that was working, but Trump obviously in the back pocket of billionaires and millionaires, what do they care about the earth? Let the earth perish, right? That's what they say, right? These new robber barons. So Trump says that too. So green energy tax incentives down the drain. Sorry, Greta Thunberg. And restrictions on food stamps. The bill still shifts the cost of SNAP food stamps in some states. The program is fully funded by the federal government. The federal government will continue to fully fund the benefits for states that have an error payment below 6%. So states with error rates above 6% will be on the hook for 5 to 15% of the cost. States have given some flexibility in calculating their share. The package also aligns with the initial House version on the age requirements for able-bodied adults to qualify for SNAP. Currently, in order to qualify able-bodied adults between the ages of 50 and 54, the work requirements, both the House and the Senate bill will update the age requirements to 18 and 64. So basically what this is saying is that there's going to be harsher restrictions on SNAP. Now, there was a rumor going around that Trump was going to restrict what one could buy with snacks and with SNAP, and it was going to only be healthy stuff, right? Basically, something a more harsher, authoritarian version of what Michelle Obama was trying to do with her anti-obesity initiatives. Now, and Republicans had no problems with this, because this allows them to say that they're doing their job. They're getting rid of welfare queens, as Ronald Reagan would put it. So they had a problem when Michelle Obama was trying to tell us what to do, quote unquote, telling us what to do, comparing that to tyranny, comparing that to the tyranny of King George III, who was the king on the throne during the time of the American Revolution. But this is even more tyrannical because Trump basically wants to starve people, right? He wants to starve out the poor and eliminate the poor and eliminate the those of lesser income by moving them out, but basically just starving them out. That's basically what he aims to do. Like, this is true tyranny. This is true tyranny. This is the kind of tyranny that the American founding fathers revolted against. The exact kind of tyranny that they revolted against. Government overreach, big government, her harming the people. If the big government is going to exist and a robust federal government is going to exist, at least have it serve the people's needs, serve for the poor, right? Serve for the unfortunate, the less fortunate. Now, people say, of course, well, people make it bad for themselves by abusing the system. Well, make the system more efficient so they wouldn't be unable to abuse it. But no, you don't want to do that. You want to completely cut it and completely gut it and completely get rid of it. And this big, beautiful bill is basically the culmination of what Democratic elected officials have been trying to do since the beginning of the 20th century, which is basically get rid of or not have or they have to get rid of them because modern liberalism was so successful that these programs like the Great Society and the New Deal, they passed with flying colors. So now they have to re-educate the people and make them against these sort of social programs by stoking the flames of xenophobia, stoking the flames of racism, saying that it's the minorities, it's the Mexicans, the black people leeching off the system, and they're the ones we're trying to hurt. But they don't realize the system is not segregated. There's not one Medicaid for black people and one Medicaid for white people. There's not one Social Security for white people and one for black people. If the thing gets cut, it gets cut for everybody. So you're cutting off your nose despite your face. You know what I'm saying? You want to hurt the minorities. You want to hurt the trans people. You want to hurt black people. You know, those individuals. You want to hurt them, but in order to hurt them, you have to hurt yourself. You have to hurt the rest of us because of your racist agenda. And that's what this is going to do. This is going to be really scary for people with disabilities, extremely scary, which is why in the state capitol, a couple of, like a week or so ago, people with disabilities were actually being arrested and apprehended because of their protest of this bill. Because this bill will severely impact working families and families of people with disabilities, especially the SNAP restrictions and especially the Medicaid restrictions. Because the Medicaid restrictions, now if before this bill passed, you better hope that things that you put in place that you ordered through Medicaid, like equipment or adaptive devices, go through the Medicaid before have already gone through. Like, I just received a shower chair. That doesn't really count because that was already put in process before this bill was passed, like today, right? So if that's the case, then you may still get whatever you're requesting. But if not, it's going to be very hard to get this kind of stuff. You know what I mean? Because now Trump wants to leave it up to the state. So in order for the state to do it, a state is a much larger, a much smaller jurisdiction than the federal government. So they're going to have to raise the sales tax on items and making the items 10 times more expensive. Now, think of that in terms of food. Okay, so if they're cutting the SNAP benefits, right, and they're making it harder to qualify for SNAP, especially if you're working, that's going to decrease the amount of food intake, the amount of food purchases by people, right? And that's going to crash the economy because if people aren't buying things and the economy isn't circulating, if the economy isn't circulating, then the country is strangled. Um, Trump is doing these things. He's doing these, what he calls these big, beautiful things. But this is like the tariffs. This is hurting America. This is hurting the consumer. This is going back to, again, what I said, a retrograde presidency, back to the time before the Great Depression. He's restricting the idea of liberty. On today, the 4th of July, we celebrate liberty. We celebrate this idea founded in the Magna Carta and then embellished in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I beseech you to go into that last phrase, that phrase that was tacked on to the final draft of the Constitution by Thomas Jefferson. Remember, I said he took the slave part out. He took life, liberty, and property, because that was the original idea founded by the enlightened philosopher John Locke, right? The idea of life, liberty, and property. Because in those days, the governments of, the king's government in France and England, wherever, could confiscate a person's property. And they wanted to make sure that in their imagined republic, in their new republic in the United States, that wouldn't happen. But it actually is. It actually is right now with this big, beautiful bill. Because what eventually will happen is that they won't confiscate your property, but things will be so expensive that the poor and the destitute won't be able to afford any property because things will be so astronomically expensive, which by the combination of Trump's big, beautiful bill and the tariffs. But I question, what is beautiful about this bill? Like, where's the beauty in the bill? Is it doing anything good? Is it affirming anything positive? No, it's taking away. And that to me has always been something that I've said about Republicans that I dislike. I dislike that Republicans, they never offer solutions. They only offer criticisms. They say, okay, well, the budget is too high in the United States. You know what I mean? We need to stop spending and we need to decrease spending and increase revenue, right? Okay, everybody does that. We do that in our households. We do that in our personal lives. We do that everywhere. But what Trump wants to do is he wants to increase military spending. He doesn't want to decrease spending across the board. This big, beautiful bill increases military spending and decreases spending on social safety nets. So it's being sold to you as massive tax cuts, as this great overhaul of programs like the Great Society and in the New Deal. If that's how it's being sold to you, but in actuality, what it is military contractors and people in the military-industrial complex, what President Eisenhower warned us about getting entangled with. That was in the 50s. This was just starting, where America was becoming in a state of perpetual war. Because how do you justify during peacetime an increase in federal spending? You're in peacetime. You're not at war. They'll say, okay, we have imagined adversaries. We have adversaries in Iran, China, and Russia, right? The terrorist organizations, like ISIS, remnants that still exist, ISIS-K or the Taliban or whatever, even though we're at peace with them right now. Both parties, ISIS in Syria and the Taliban in Afghanistan, right? Okay, but they still want this bloated military. But you have to, in order to justify having a bloated military, you have to engage in perpetual war. Fortunately for Trump, The Middle East is always a contentious area. You can use the plight of Israel and the plight of Zionism to advocate for perpetual war in the Middle East. Asia is China is always stuck in our craw. The fact that we never, during the Chinese Civil War in 1949, we never helped Chiang Kai-shek and the who will become the Taiwanese, the Chinese nationalists. We never helped them. Truman dropped the ball with them. He didn't want to get involved. So Republicans still have it in their craw about that. Russia, Republicans really don't care necessarily about that. I mean, they admire Putin. They consider Putin to be a friend, especially the Trump regime. So they don't really care about that. But that's more of a liberal thing. A liberal case, cause du jour. But as far as these other two, China and Iran, Russia, I mean, Trump could easily use this, use the threats of China and Iran and North Korea as justifications for increased military spending, because that's the ultimate objective. When Republicans cut spending, they don't cut spending across the board. They can only cut spending the stuff that you need, stuff that impacts your life personally. Trump personally has a nephew with a disability, and he told this nephew that he's better off dead. So Trump believes that the quality of life for disabled Americans should be diminished to such a degree that they no longer have the right to live, and that's really fucked up. You know what I mean? And that is fascism. That is fascism. That is the belief, the Übermensch mentality that Friedrich Nietzsche, infused into what will become the Nazi ideology, the ideology of the German Reich. The idea that the fittest man is the most worthiest man, the unfit man and the subhuman, like the Jewish people or black people or racial minorities that are disabled or gays, don't deserve life. And they can't do it directly in the way that Hitler did it. He did it with the Nuremberg laws, and that's where it starts. It starts, and the founders understood this. The founders of the United States understood that if you take away someone's rights, if you take away their smaller rights, if you take away their fundamental human rights that are endowed to them by their Creator, as the Declaration says, then you are essentially taking away their rights. If they can't eat, how can they worry or occupy their mind with voting? How can they worry and occupy their mind with lofty ideals such as freedom of speech if they can't even eat, if they can't afford a wheelchair to go outside because you got Medicaid to such an extent? How can that be? You know what I'm saying? So you have to understand that within these statements of negative liberties, like freedom of speech and freedom of the press and freedom of religion, are implied realities. You have to have the ADA, so these buildings, these religious buildings, the religious institutions, temples, mosques, synagogues, churches could be accessible, right? The streets could be accessible. You overturn something like the ADA, which in actuality, President George H.W. Bush enacted, a Republican president. You overturn something like that, right? What the bill is not saying to do that, but I'm saying this is just a start. You overturn something like that, then a disabled person's life, quality of life is severely diminished, and their voice doesn't matter. You essentially muted them without taking away any of their negative liberty rights by erasing these positive liberties, these liberties that the government can give you, as opposed to not just liberties that the government cannot take away. And that is the belief, the difference between classical liberals, like the libertarians of the Jefferson ilk, that believe that, okay, everyone should just be free to do everything, and the government should be small as an ant and shouldn't interfere in your life in any sort of capacity. We all believe that. Ideally, we all believe that. Ideally, that is the foundation of American democracy. But how do we get there? How do we guarantee that for all citizens, the less fortunate among us? We do that by granting them positive rights, by granting them assistance, by granting them a strong social safety net, by granting them 8-hour workdays, all this stuff that Democrats over the years, over the course of the things that we've outlined, have fought for. But he's trying to take that away. So Lisa is saying the 4th of July is canceled because of Trump. There is disputes about this bill. People that hate this bill. I hope the Democrats fight. I hope they fight hard to, like with the Obamacare thing, to have it not go through because we don't need this. This is not something we need. The country is as much as divided as it were, in the 1850s, right on the eve of the Civil War. Bleeding Kansas, the Missouri Compromise, things of that nature. We're as divided then as we were. We're just as divided now as we were then. And something like the ADA, it wasn't just like we see presidents pass this stuff, like the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act with Johnson, or the ADA in the 1990s with Bush Senior. But these things are not given to us. They are fought for. Everything that we've got in this country, including the fact that we're a republic and not a monarchy, including the first act of rebellion ever demonstrated on American soil, which is the rebellion against the British Crown. Well, not the first, because like 100 years before that, there was in 1676 there was a revolt of indentured laborers and African slaves called Beacon's Rebellion. But the powers that be managed to get into the heads of the white indentured laborers and convince them that because they're racially different or because they're biological determining factors that are different than the Africans, that they are superior to the Africans. So they figured out a scheme where they can convince the lowest white man that he is superior to the highest black man. They're ensuring that he will ultimately vote for his own destruction and cut off his nose despite his face, if only he could hold on to that power, that imaginary power of whiteness. It's an imaginary power because it has no power. The power is given to him by the system, which is white privilege. White privilege doesn't mean that a person is born white, they have life easy. They clearly don't. It depends on individual circumstances. But one thing it does entail is that we don't have to worry about race. Race is a constant. The idea of race and the obstacles presented to people of color because of racism are constantly smacked in the faces of people of color. They're not constantly smacked in the faces of Caucasians. Caucasians are not made to feel othered in society in the way that BIPOC people are. And that is the definition of white privilege. That because of their complexion and because of their ethnicity, they have a leg up. Not necessarily a leg up personally, but a leg up as a group. And they may have to worry about and overcome other obstacles, but they don't have to overcome the obstacle of race. And that's the privilege. And the same thing, men have that privilege. As men, we don't have to overcome the obstacle of gender discrimination. Hetero, cis people don't have to overcome, homophobia or transphobia. That's all it means. It doesn't mean that because you because you belong to these particular groups that you are privileged by nature. It means that by the nature of the society, by the nature of the antiquated prejudices that accrue around the society, whether it be sexism, whether it be homophobia, whether it be transphobia, that you don't have to worry about this. You may have to worry about other obstacles, and ableism is similar. Able-bodied people don't have to worry about these obstacles. People of a higher economic status, regardless of race or ethnicity, don't have to worry about these issues. But poor people do, disabled people do have to worry about this. And this is the definition of wealthy privilege, the definition of white privilege, the definition of all kinds of unearned privileges. Not because you're being given something, it's because it's one less obstacle is removed from you. Now, you could be a white heterosexual Christian male, and you could be poor, and that could be your biggest obstacle. That's not removed from you by supporting Donald Trump. Now, he won't alleviate your suffering as a poor person if you support him because he supports policies that favor the rich, as as Republicans naturally do. Their platform favors business owners above labor. Their platform favors landowners above non-landowners, right? And able-bodied people above disabled people. And it's clearly made clear to see on full display here. So that is all, guys. Thank you, Lisa, for contributing. Thank you, guys, for watching. Sorry for the interruption earlier. Something was going on in my home, and I do. Peace. Happy 4th of July. Remember, it didn't just stop at 1776. The spirit of 1776, the spirit of rebellion, the spirit of the No Kings protest, especially this year. Because think of, we didn't trade in one king for another. We didn't trade in King George III for King Trump. Peace.